I will make you walk again. Don't cry, sir. The small voice came from beside the park bench. Richard Hartman quickly wiped his eyes and turned. Standing there was a kind little girl, no older than 8 years old, wearing a simple blue dress and holding a small stuffed rabbit in one hand. For a moment, he was too surprised to speak. "What did you say?" he asked. The little girl stepped closer. "I said I will make you walk again." Richard stared at her. Then he laughed softly through the sadness. It wasn't because he thought she was funny. It was because he had heard those same words from some of the best doctors in America, and none of them had been able to keep that promise. "You'll make me walk again?" he asked gently. The girl nodded. "Yes." Richard looked away toward the lake. A few minutes earlier, he had been sitting alone on the bench fighting back tears. 6 months ago, he had been one of Seattle's most successful billionaires. A man who ran 5 miles every morning. A man who climbed mountains for fun. A man who never needed anyone's help. Now, he couldn't even stand without assistance. The accident had changed everything. At first, doctors promised recovery. Then the recovery slowed. Then it stopped. And somehow his legs continued getting weaker instead of stronger. No one could explain why. Every month brought more disappointment. Every doctor seemed less hopeful than the last. The wheelchair that was supposed to be temporary had become part of his daily life. And for the first time in his life, Richard was afraid. Not afraid of losing money. Not afraid of losing business. Afraid of losing himself. The little girl climbed onto the bench beside him. She studied his face carefully. "My grandpa says crying doesn't make people weak." Richard smiled slightly. "Your grandpa sounds wise." "He is." "What does he do?" "He helps people walk." Richard turned toward her. "A physical therapist?" She shook her head. "A doctor." The little girl pointed toward his legs. "Can I see?" Richard hesitated. Most people treated him carefully now, like he was fragile, like he might break. But there was no pity in her eyes, only curiosity and confidence. "All right," he said. She knelt beside him and gently placed her hands on his calf. Slowly she began massaging the muscle. Her movements were calm and patient, not rushed, not careless. Richard watched her quietly. "You really think this can help?" Maybe. She nodded. "My grandpa says bodies are like people." "What does that mean?" "If nobody talks to them for a long time, they stop listening." Richard couldn't help smiling. That was one of the strangest explanations he had ever heard. Yet somehow it made sense. The little girl continued working. A few moments later, Richard felt something. A faint tingling sensation. Tiny pins and needles moving beneath the skin. His eyes widened. He hadn't felt that in weeks. The little girl noticed immediately. "You felt it?" Richard looked down. "I think so." She smiled. "Good." "What does that mean?" "It means your leg is still listening." For the first time all day, hope flickered inside him. Small, fragile, but real. The girl stood up. "Now we try standing." Richard laughed. "Standing?" "Yes. I haven't stood by myself in months." "Then today is a good day." He looked at the bench beside him. Fear tightened in his chest. What if he failed? What if nothing happened? The little girl seemed to read his thoughts. "My grandpa says not trying is worse than falling." Richard stared at her. How could someone so young sound so wise? Slowly, he placed both hands on the bench. His heart pounded. His arms pushed downward. His muscles strained. His legs trembled violently. At first, nothing happened. Then, his body rose. Only a few inches. But it rose. His eyes widened in shock. The effort lasted only a moment before he dropped back into the wheelchair, breathing heavily. The little girl smiled. Again, Richard looked at her. "You don't quit easily, do you?" "No." Taking a deep breath, he tried once more. His arms shook. His legs trembled. Every muscle screamed. Then suddenly, he was up, not completely straight, not perfectly balanced, but standing for the first time in 6 months. Richard froze. His heart hammered against his chest. He looked down at his legs in disbelief. Tears filled his eyes. "I'm standing," he whispered. The little girl smiled proudly. I told you. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself back into the wheelchair. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. Then Richard looked at her. What is your name? The little girl smiled. You can tell me yours first. For the first time in months, Richard laughed. A real laugh. The kind he thought he had forgotten. And neither of them knew it yet. But that simple meeting in a Seattle park was about to uncover a shocking secret, expose a betrayal worth millions of dollars, and save his life. Welcome to Super Stories. Today's story is one of hope, courage, betrayal, and unexpected friendship that changed everything. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from the comments. USA, Canada, UK, Australia, South Africa, Nigeria, or anywhere else in the world. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories from Super Stories. The next afternoon, Richard arrived at the park earlier than usual. For the first time in months, he had something to look forward to. Ever since standing the day before, he couldn't stop thinking about it. The feeling of his feet touching the ground. The feeling of his legs holding his weight. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, his life wasn't over after all. He rolled his wheelchair to the same bench and waited. 10 minutes later, he spotted the kind little girl running down the path. She smiled when she saw him. You came back. You sound surprised. I'm not surprised, she said. I knew you would. Richard laughed. You seem very confident about everything. The little girl sat beside him. My grandpa says people who want to get better usually come back. Richard smiled. Then he noticed something unusual. The little girl seemed quieter than normal, almost nervous. Is something wrong? He asked. She looked down at her shoes. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside was a single white pill. Richard stared at it. What is that? The little girl held it carefully. I found this. Richard's smile disappeared. His heart suddenly beat faster. The pill looked familiar. Very familiar. Where did you get that? He asked. The little girl looked around before answering. A few weeks ago, I was at your house. My house. She nodded. My mom cleans there sometimes. Richard frowned. The little girl continued. A lady was putting medicine into her bag. She dropped one pill and didn't notice. Richard felt a strange chill. My fiancée? I think so. He stared at the pill. The same shape, the same size, the same color as the medication he took every morning. What did you do with it? He asked. I took it to my grandpa. Richard's expression changed. Why? The little girl looked up. Because something felt wrong. The park suddenly seemed quieter. The sounds of children playing faded into background. What did your grandpa say? The little girl took a deep breath. He said it wasn't medicine for healing. Richard froze. What? She nodded. He said it's medicine that makes muscles weaker if someone takes it for a long time. Richard stared at her. For a second, he thought he had heard wrong. Weaker? Yes. His mouth suddenly felt dry. That's impossible. The little girl didn't argue. She simply continued. My grandpa said if someone keeps taking it every day, they could slowly lose strength in their legs. Richard looked away. His hands tightened around the armrest of the wheelchair. For 6 months, his legs had done exactly that. Lost strength. Slowly. Day after day. Month after month. No, he whispered. The little girl looked at him sadly. There's more. Richard turned back. What more? The little girl hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. One day, I heard her talking on the phone. Richard's chest tightened. What did she say? The little girl swallowed. She said, in a few months he won't be able to walk at all. The world seemed to stop. Richard stared at her. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Are you sure? The little girl nodded. She also said, after the wedding, everything will be under my control. Richard felt cold, very cold. For months, his fiancée had cared for him. She brought him his medication. She attended doctor's appointments. She told everyone she was helping him through the hardest time of his life. And now this child was telling him something impossible. Something terrifying. Something he didn't want to believe. Maybe you misunderstood. The little girl shook her head. Maybe. Then she looked directly into his eyes. But if I'm wrong, checking won't hurt. Richard stared at her. The simple truth of those words struck him harder than anything else. If she was wrong, nothing changed. If she was right, his entire life was built on a lie. The little girl stood up. We should practice. Richard barely heard her. His mind was racing. The pills, the weakness, the phone call, the wedding in 3 weeks. The way his condition kept getting worse instead of better. Suddenly, questions he had ignored for months began crashing together inside his head. The little girl touched his arm gently. Don't be scared. Richard looked at her. Why not? She smiled softly. Because now you know where to look. For the first time since the accident, Richard realized something. Maybe the biggest danger wasn't his illness. Maybe the biggest danger was trusting the wrong person. And that evening, after returning home, he would make a decision that would change everything. That night, Richard barely slept. He sat alone in his study long after midnight, staring at the city lights beyond the tall windows of his Seattle mansion. The little girl's words replayed in his mind again and again. In a few months, he won't be able to walk at all. After the wedding, everything will be under my control. He wanted to dismiss it. He wanted to believe a child had simply misunderstood a conversation, but something wouldn't let him. For 6 months, his condition had steadily worsened, not improved, not stabilized, worsened, and no doctor had ever been able to explain why. At exactly 7 the next morning, he heard a knock. The door opened. His fiancée entered carrying a glass of water and the familiar white pill bottle. Good morning, she said with a warm smile. How are your legs today? Richard forced a smile. About the same. She shook 2 pills into her hand. Take these. The doctor says consistency is important. For a brief moment, Richard simply stared at the pills. Every morning, every evening, for 6 months. The same routine, the same smile, the same reassurance. These will help you recover. His stomach tightened. He took the pills and placed them in his mouth. Then he drank the water. She watched carefully. Satisfied, she smiled. Good. A few minutes later, she left the room. The moment the door closed, Richard rolled quickly into the bathroom. He leaned over the sink and spat the pills into his hand. His heart was pounding. He stared at the 2 white tablets resting in his palm. For the first time, he wasn't looking at medicine. He was looking at evidence. Carefully, he wrapped them in tissue and hid them inside his desk drawer. Then he picked up his phone. There was only one person he trusted enough to call, an old friend of his late father, a physician who had known Richard for more than 20 years, someone with no connection to the doctors currently treating him. When the man answered, Richard spoke quietly. I need your help. 2 hours later, the doctor arrived through a side entrance. No staff, no records, no announcements, just a private visit. The doctor sat across from him in the study. You sound worried, he said. Richard handed him the tissue. I need these tested. The doctor opened the tissue and examined the pills. Where did you get them? They were given to me this morning. The doctor's expression became serious. Let's see what we're dealing with. From his bag, he removed a compact testing kit. Richard watched in silence as the doctor carefully scraped a small amount from one pill and mixed it with several testing solutions. Minutes passed. Neither man spoke. Finally, the doctor looked up. His face had changed. The color had drained from it. What is it? Richard asked. The doctor placed the pill on the desk. Richard, this isn't recovery medication. Richard felt his pulse quicken. What do you mean? The doctor took a deep breath. This is a powerful muscle relaxant. The room suddenly felt smaller. Richard stared at him. A muscle relaxant? The doctor nodded. In short-term use, it has legitimate medical purposes. He paused. But in long-term use and in these doses, Richard leaned forward. What happens? The doctor's eyes met his. It causes progressive muscle weakness. Silence filled the room. Richard felt as though someone had punched him in the chest. The doctor continued. The longer a person takes it, the weaker their muscles become. Richard looked at the wheelchair, then back at the pills, then back at the doctor. Are you saying this medication could be causing my condition? The doctor nodded slowly. Yes. The single word hit like a hammer. For several seconds, Richard couldn't speak. All those months, all those appointments, all those promises, all those mornings and evenings taking pills, he believed were helping him. And every single day, they had been making him worse. The doctor lowered his voice. If someone wanted a healthy man to slowly lose the ability to walk, this would do it. Richard's hands clenched into fists. The little girl had been right. Every word, every warning, every suspicion. She had been right. The doctor looked at him carefully. Who gave you these? Richard stared at the pills, then at the photographs hanging on his wall. Pictures of mountain climbs, marathons, victories, a life that now felt very far away. Finally, he answered, the person I was planning to marry. The doctor sat in stunned silence. Neither man spoke for several moments. Then Richard looked down at his legs. For the first time in months, he felt something stronger than fear. Anger, because this wasn't an illness. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a failed recovery. Someone had done this to him. Someone he loved. Someone he trusted. And now he intended to find out exactly why. That afternoon, Richard returned to the park. The kind little girl was already waiting. The moment she saw his face, she knew. You tested the pills. Richard nodded. The little girl's expression remained calm. What did the doctor say? Richard looked at her. His voice was barely above a whisper. He said they were making me weak. The little girl wasn't surprised. She simply nodded. My grandpa was right. Richard stared at her. No. A small smile appeared on his face. You were right. The little girl smiled back, and neither of them realized it yet, but they had just taken the first step toward exposing a betrayal worth millions of dollars and bringing down a woman who thought she had already won. The little girl looked up at Richard and smiled. Today we take a step. Richard laughed nervously. A step? She nodded. Yesterday you stood. Today you take a step. Richard looked down at his legs. Just standing had exhausted him. The idea of actually walking seemed impossible. But then again, standing had seemed impossible too. The little girl pointed toward a stone bench near the garden path. Use that. Richard rolled his wheelchair closer. The afternoon sun warmed the patio stones beneath him. Birds chirped in the trees overhead, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass through the yard. It was peaceful, a sharp contrast to the storm raging inside his mind. Only hours earlier, a doctor had confirmed that someone had been secretly weakening him for months. Someone he trusted, someone he loved, someone he planned to marry. Richard pushed those thoughts aside. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered. Getting stronger. The little girl stood beside him. Slowly, Richard placed both hands on the stone bench. His muscles tightened. His heart pounded. Then he pushed upward. The effort made his arms tremble immediately. His legs shook beneath him. But this time they held. He stood. Not perfectly. Not comfortably. But he stood. The little girl smiled. Good. Richard took several deep breaths. The muscles in his legs burned. The sensation felt strange. Painful. Yet somehow encouraging. His body was working again. Now move your foot. Richard swallowed. The simple instruction felt enormous. What if I fall? The little girl shrugged. Then you stand again. He couldn't help smiling. Everything sounded so simple when she said it. Carefully, he shifted his weight. His right foot moved forward. Only a few inches. But it moved. Richard froze. His eyes widened. The little girl grinned. That's one. A strange emotion rushed through him. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It was something deeper. Hope. For 6 months, every week had brought bad news. Every appointment had lowered expectations. Every test had offered another reason to accept defeat. Now he had proof that those predictions were wrong. His leg had moved. Not because of medicine. Not because of a miracle. Because he had fought for it. Again, the little girl said. Richard moved his left foot. The movement was awkward and shaky. But it happened. 2 steps. His breathing became heavier. Sweat appeared on his forehead. His legs felt as if they might collapse. The little girl watched carefully. You can stop if you need to. Richard looked at her. Then he shook his head. No, he wasn't stopping. Not anymore. For months, he had been moving backward, without knowing why. Now, he finally understood the truth. Someone had been pushing him down, and now he was pushing back. With a deep breath, he moved his foot again. 3 steps. The effort drained every ounce of energy from him. Finally, he lowered himself back into wheelchair. His chest rose and fell rapidly. The little girl smiled proudly. Tomorrow we do more. Richard laughed. You always have a plan for tomorrow. She nodded. That's because you're getting better. Richard looked down at his legs. For the first time since the accident, he believed those words. Not because a doctor said them. Not because a medical chart said them. Because he could feel it himself. The little girl sat beside him on the bench. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard asked quietly, "Why did you help me?" The girl looked surprised. "Why wouldn't I? Most people wouldn't get involved." She thought about that. Then she shrugged. "My grandpa says when you see someone falling, you help them stand." Richard looked away. Such a simple answer. Yet it carried more wisdom than most of the advice he had received in the last 6 months. The little girl suddenly became serious. "She doesn't know, does she?" Richard knew exactly who she meant. "No." The girl nodded. "Good." Richard looked at her. "Why good?" "Because people who do bad things stop being careful when they think they already won." Those words stayed with him long after they left the backyard. That evening, Richard sat alone in his study. The hidden pills were locked in a drawer. The doctor's report was safely stored. And his mind kept returning to one question. If the woman he loved had truly been behind this, why? Money? Control? Revenge? Whatever the answer was, he intended to find out, because every step he took was making him stronger, and every step was bringing him closer to the truth. That night, Richard sat alone in his study staring at the small pile of white pills hidden inside his desk drawer. The doctor's test had confirmed the pills were making him weaker, but he still needed proof that someone had given them to him on purpose. There was only one way to find out. He picked up his phone and called his head of security. "I need access to every security camera in the house," Richard said. Within an hour, the security chief arrived with a laptop and several months of recordings. They began reviewing footage from the kitchen, hallways, and living areas. For nearly 2 hours, they found nothing unusual. Then Richard noticed movement on one recording. "Stop," he said. The footage froze. His fiancée stood alone in the kitchen late at night. No staff, no visitors, no witnesses. Richard's heart began to pound. "Play it." The video continued. She removed 2 pill bottles from a cabinet. One bottle had Richard's name on it. The other did not. She looked around carefully before opening both containers. Then she poured pills from one bottle into the other. Richard felt his stomach tighten. The room went silent. The security chief stared at the screen. Neither man spoke. The video continued. After switching the pills, she picked up her phone and made a call. There was no audio, but Richard could clearly read part of her lips. In a few months, he won't be able to walk at all. His blood ran cold. The same words the little girl had repeated. The same warning he had dismissed. The same sentence that now appeared right before his eyes. The call ended. His fiancée smiled. Then she left the kitchen carrying the bottle. The recording stopped. For several moments, nobody spoke. Finally, the security chief broke the silence. "Do you want copies?" Richard's jaw tightened. 3 copies. The man nodded. "One for my lawyer," Richard continued. "One for me. And one somewhere safe." The security chief immediately began exporting the files. Richard leaned back in his wheelchair. The evidence was real. The pills, the doctor's report, the security footage. This was no misunderstanding, no mistake, no accident. Someone had been planning this. And that someone was the woman he intended to marry in less than 3 weeks. As the security chief left the room, Richard stared out the window. For 6 months, He had believed he was losing his ability to walk. Now he understood the truth. He wasn't losing a battle against illness. He was surviving a betrayal. The next morning, Richard woke before sunrise. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about his condition. He was thinking about motive. Why would someone do this? Why would someone spend months weakening him? The answer that kept returning was one word: money. By mid-morning, his lawyer arrived carrying several folders and a laptop. Richard closed the study door behind him. "What did you find?" he asked. The lawyer sat down and opened the first folder. "More than I expected." Richard's stomach tightened. The lawyer slid several documents across the desk. "Over the last 6 months, nearly $20 million has been moved from accounts connected to your estate." Richard frowned. "$20 million?" The lawyer nodded. Most of the transfers were small enough not to attract attention, but together they add up. Richard studied the paperwork. The signatures were his, or at least they appeared to be. "I don't remember approving any of this." "You probably didn't," the lawyer replied. He opened another file. 3 months ago, a medical power of attorney was signed. Richard looked up sharply. "A what?" "A document giving someone authority to make medical decisions on your behalf if you're unable to." Richard's face darkened. "And who received that authority?" The lawyer met his eyes. "Your fiancée." Silence filled the room. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair. The pieces were beginning to fit together. If he became too weak to walk, if doctors believed his condition was permanent, if he became dependent on others, then she would control his medical decisions, his finances, his future, everything. The lawyer opened one final folder. "There's more." Richard looked at him. "The wedding contracts." "What about them?" The lawyer hesitated. "Several clauses transfer significant assets to her immediately after the marriage." Richard stared at the documents. The wedding was only 2 weeks away. 2 weeks. That realization hit him harder than anything else. This wasn't a plan for the future. It was already happening. The lawyer closed the folder. "What do you want to do?" Richard looked toward the window. Outside, the world appeared normal. Cars moved through the streets. People walked by. Life continued. But inside his study, everything had changed. For months, he thought he was fighting to recover. Now he understood the truth. He was fighting to save his life. And for the first time since the accident, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt determination. Because every day he was getting stronger. Every day he was taking more steps. And every day he was getting closer to exposing the woman who thought she had already won. That afternoon, Richard went straight to the backyard. The moment he arrived, the kind little girl appeared from the garden path. She smiled when she saw him. "You look different." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Happier." For the first time in a long while, Richard realized she was right. He wasn't happy because his problems were gone. He was happy because he finally understood them. And once you understand a problem, you can fight it. "Let's practice," the little girl said. Richard rolled closer to the stone bench. Without hesitation, he placed his hands on the bench and pushed himself up. The little girl's eyes widened. That was easier. It was, Richard admitted. A week ago, standing had taken everything he had. Now he could do it in seconds. His legs still shook, but not as much. The strength was returning. Slowly, day by day, but it was returning. "Okay," the little girl said. "Let's walk." Richard nodded. Carefully, he took 1 step, then another, 3 steps, 4, 5. For a moment, he forgot to be afraid. The little girl clapped excitedly. "See? I told you." Richard laughed. "I remember when 1 step felt impossible. Now 5 steps are easy." "Not easy," Richard corrected. The little girl smiled. "Then tomorrow they'll be easier." Richard sat back in the wheelchair, breathing heavily. But unlike before, this exhaustion felt good. It felt earned. The little girl sat beside him. "How many days until the wedding?" 14. She frowned. "That's not much time." "No, you have to keep getting stronger." Richard nodded. "I know." The little girl looked at him seriously. "Are you going to tell everyone what she did?" Richard looked toward the house. The large mansion stood quietly in the distance. For months, he had believed it was his home. Now it felt more like a trap. "Yes," he said finally, "but not yet." The little girl tilted her head. "Why?" "Because people like her think they've already won." The girl smiled. "My grandpa says that's when they make mistakes." Richard laughed. "Your grandpa is a smart man." The little girl suddenly became thoughtful. "Do you know what I think?" "What?" "I think she wants everyone to see you in that wheelchair." Richard looked down at the chair. "Why?" "Because if people think you're weak, they won't ask questions." The words hit him hard, because deep down he knew she was right. The wheelchair wasn't just a chair anymore. It was part of the lie. A lie that would soon come crashing down. Richard looked at his legs. 2 weeks ago, he couldn't stand. Now he could walk several steps. In 2 more weeks, anything was possible. The little girl stood and pointed toward the patio. "One more time." Richard smiled. "One more time." He pushed himself up again. And this time he took 7 steps. Neither of them knew it yet, but those 7 steps were carrying him toward a moment that would shock everyone at the wedding, including the woman who had worked so hard to keep him from ever walking again. The days passed quickly. Every morning, Richard pretended to take the pills. Every afternoon, he met the kind little girl in the backyard. And every evening, he worked with his lawyer. By the end of the first week, he could walk across the entire patio with only a cane. His legs still felt weak, but the improvement was impossible to ignore. The doctor had been right. Once the pills were gone, his body began recovering. The woman who thought she was helping him grow weaker had no idea he was getting stronger every day. One evening, Richard sat in his study reviewing evidence. The security footage, the doctor's report, the financial records, the signed documents. Everything was neatly organized in folders on his desk. His lawyer sat across from him. "We have enough," the lawyer said. "Enough for what?" Richard asked. "Enough to stop the wedding." Richard shook his head. "No." The lawyer looked surprised. "No, I don't want to stop it." "Richard, after everything she's done." "I know exactly what she's done." The lawyer fell silent. Richard looked toward the window. The wedding was only 7 days away. For months, she had planned every detail. She believed she was about to win. She believed she was about to gain control of his fortune. She believed he would be sitting helplessly in a wheelchair while she smiled in front of hundreds of guests. Richard smiled slightly. Let her think that. The lawyer stared at him. Then understanding appeared on his face. "You want everyone to see the truth." Richard nodded. "Exactly." The next afternoon, he shared the plan with the kind little girl. She listened carefully. When he finished, she grinned. "So you're going to surprise her?" Richard laughed. "You could say that." The little girl pointed at his cane. "Then you need to stop using that." Richard raised an eyebrow. "That's ambitious." "You walked 10 steps yesterday." 12. She smiled proudly. "Then today we do 15. Richard shook his head, laughing. Every time he thought he had reached his limit, she pushed him a little further. And somehow, she was usually right. He stood up, slowly, steadily. Then he began walking. 1 step, 2, 3. By the time he reached 15, sweat covered his forehead. But he had done it. The little girl clapped. Richard smiled. For the first time since the accident, he could imagine something clearly. The wedding day. The shocked faces, the truth finally coming out. And one more thing, him standing on his own 2 feet. The countdown had begun. Only 1 week remained, and the woman who thought she had broken him was about to discover just how wrong she had been. The wedding day arrived. The grand ballroom overlooking Seattle's waterfront was filled with guests, business leaders, politicians, friends, family members. Nearly 300 people had gathered to witness what many called the wedding of the year. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. A string quartet played softly. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne. Everything looked perfect, exactly as she had planned. The bride stood in a private room, smiling as assistants adjusted the final details of her dress. She glanced at her reflection and smiled. In just a few minutes, she believed everything would belong to her. The fortune, the influence, the future she had carefully prepared for. Meanwhile, in another room, Richard sat quietly. A wheelchair stood beside him, but he wasn't sitting in it. He was standing. His lawyer straightened his tie. "Are you ready?" Richard looked at himself in the mirror. 6 months ago, he had been running marathons. Then he had spent months believing he would never walk again. Now, he stood on his own, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but standing. "Yes," he said, "I'm ready." A few minutes later, guests took their seats. The music changed. Everyone turned toward the entrance. Whispers spread through the room. People expected to see Richard being pushed down the aisle in a wheelchair. Instead, the doors opened, and Richard walked in. The room froze. A gasp moved through the crowd. Several guests stood up in disbelief. Others stared with their mouths open. Even the musicians missed a note. Richard walked slowly but confidently toward the front of the room. One step, then another, then another. The bride's smile disappeared. Confusion flashed across her face. Then fear, real fear. She stared at him as if she were seeing a ghost. Richard stopped a few feet away from her. The ballroom was completely silent. "You look surprised," he said calmly. She forced a nervous smile. "Richard, you're walking." "Yes." His voice remained steady. "I am." The guests looked between them, sensing something was wrong. The bride tried to recover. "This is wonderful news." "It is." Richard nodded, especially since the pills stopped. The color drained from her face. The room grew even quieter. "What pills?" she asked. Richard looked at the audience, then back at her. "The pills that were slowly making me unable to walk." Murmurs spread through the crowd. The bride's hands began to tremble. Richard's lawyer stepped forward, carrying a folder. "Richard," she whispered, but he wasn't finished. He turned toward the large screen behind the stage. A technician pressed a button. The security footage appeared. Guests watched in stunned silence as the video showed her switching pills in the kitchen. Then another video appeared. Financial records, account transfers, documents, evidence, more evidence, and more. The ballroom erupted with shocked whispers. Several guests couldn't believe what they were seeing. Others pulled out their phones. The bride looked around desperately. Her carefully built world was collapsing in front of everyone. Richard looked directly at her. "For 6 months, I thought I was losing my health." His voice echoed through the room. "But I wasn't losing my health." He paused. "I was being robbed of it." No one spoke. No one moved. The truth had finally come into the light, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. The ballroom remained silent. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. The giant screen behind Richard displayed the final piece of evidence while guests stared in shock. The bride looked around desperately. A few minutes earlier, she had believed she was about to marry a billionaire. Now she stood exposed before hundreds of people. The woman who had spent months pretending to care for Richard suddenly found herself with nowhere to run. Several guests quietly stepped away from her. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Richard's lawyer handed copies of the evidence to investigators who had been waiting nearby. Within minutes, the wedding was over, not postponed, not delayed. Over. The dream she had built on lies collapsed in a single afternoon. Richard watched as she was escorted from the ballroom. He felt anger. He felt disappointment. But more than anything else, he felt relief. The nightmare was finally ending. For months, he had believed his body was failing. For months, he had blamed himself. For months, he had accepted limits that were never supposed to be there. Now he knew the truth, and the truth had set him free. A few weeks later, Richard returned to the same park where everything had begun. The sun was shining. Children were playing. Birds filled the air with song. And for the first time in a very long time, Richard walked into the park without a wheelchair, without a cane, without help. Step by step, he crossed the path until he reached a familiar bench. A small voice called out, "You walk much better now." Richard turned and smiled. The kind little girl was standing there. He laughed. "I guess you were right." She grinned. "I know." They sat together on the bench. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard looked at her. "You saved my life." The little girl shook her head. "No." Richard frowned. "No." She smiled. "You saved your own life. I just told you where to look." Richard sat quietly for a moment. Then he nodded. Perhaps she was right. The strongest step he ever took wasn't the first one he made on weak legs. It was the moment he decided to stop believing a lie and start searching for the truth. As the afternoon sun slowly sank toward the horizon, Richard stood up, strong, healthy, free, and for the first time in many months, the future no longer frightened him. It excited him, because he had learned something that would stay with him forever. Sometimes the people who help us most are not the richest, the most powerful, or the most educated. Sometimes they are simply the people who care enough to tell us the truth. Life lesson from this story: never ignore small warning signs just because they come from unexpected people. Kindness can change a life. One caring person can make all the difference. Trust is valuable, but trust should never replace wisdom. Not every person who smiles at you has your best interests at heart. The truth may be hidden for a while, but it has a way of revealing itself. Real strength is not just physical. It is the courage to keep fighting when life becomes difficult. Sometimes your greatest breakthrough begins with one small step. Never stop trying. As the little girl said, failing after trying is far better than never trying at all. Money can attract people, but character reveals who truly belongs in your life. Hope is powerful. The moment you believe change is possible, your journey can begin. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Super Stories like this video and share it with someone who might need a little hope today. And before you go, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? USA, Canada, UK, Australia, South Africa, Nigeria, or somewhere else in the world? We'd love to hear from you.